Some of the people carrying the heaviest emotional weight are the ones nobody ever worries about. Not because they are strong all the time, not because they have life figured out, and not because they do not feel pain, but because they became experts at hiding it. The quietest empaths often move through life unnoticed emotionally. They learn how to sit in rooms full of people while saying very little about themselves. They become observers, listeners, the calm presence everyone else leans on. And after a while, people stop asking if they are okay, because they always seem okay. But what most people never realize is that quiet empaths are usually absorbing far more than they ever express. They notice the shift in someone's voice before anyone else does. They notice when somebody says, "I'm fine," differently than they did yesterday. They notice tension before arguments happen, distance before abandonment, sadness before tears, and they carry all of it internally. Most people think emotional exhaustion looks dramatic, like panic attacks, breakdowns, crying for help. But sometimes, emotional exhaustion looks incredibly calm. Sometimes, it looks like the quiet person staring out the window, the person who says, "I'm just tired," the person who disappears for a few days to recover emotionally without telling anyone why. Because quiet empaths often learned very early in life that expressing too much emotion did not feel safe. Maybe they were ignored. Maybe they were misunderstood. Maybe every time they opened up, somebody minimized what they felt or made them feel weak for feeling deeply. So eventually they stopped explaining themselves, and that silence slowly became part of who they are. But silence does not mean emptiness. In fact, some of the deepest emotional worlds exist inside people who barely talk about themselves at all. The quiet empath often walks through life carrying invisible weight nobody can see. And because they carry it so gracefully, people assume it must not be heavy. That is the tragedy of highly sensitive people. The better they become at handling emotional pain, the less anyone notices they are struggling. A quiet empath can spend years being emotionally available for everyone else, while secretly feeling completely unseen themselves. They become the safe place for others, the understanding friend, the emotionally patient partner, the person people vent to at 2 in the morning. But very few people stop long enough to ask what happens when the listener becomes emotionally exhausted. What happens when the person carrying everyone else starts drowning quietly? Most quiet empaths never learned how to prioritize themselves emotionally. They learned how to survive emotionally, and there is a difference. Because survival teaches people to suppress, to adapt, to stay small, to become emotionally low maintenance. But eventually, that emotional suppression catches up to them. Not all at once, but slowly. It becomes mental exhaustion, emotional numbness, burnout that feels impossible to explain. Sometimes they stop answering messages. Sometimes they isolate themselves. Sometimes they become quieter than usual because their emotional system is overloaded. And the strange part is, most people never notice the warning signs because the quiet empath still appears functional. They still show up, still smile, still say, "I'm good," still carry conversations. But internally, they are exhausted from carrying emotional energy that was never theirs to hold in the first place. And the older they get, the more they begin realizing something painful. Not everyone deserves access to their emotional energy. That realization changes quiet empaths deeply, because for most of their life, they believed love meant understanding everyone, being patient, being available, being forgiving. They thought if they gave enough empathy, people would eventually give the same energy back. But many quiet empaths eventually discover something heartbreaking. Some people are only drawn to empathy because they want somewhere to unload themselves, not because they truly see the empath. And that realization creates a kind of emotional loneliness that is difficult to explain, because quiet empaths often feel deeply connected to people, while secretly feeling emotionally disconnected themselves. They understand everybody, but almost nobody understands them. That imbalance slowly becomes exhausting, especially because quiet empaths rarely demand emotional attention. They are not usually the loudest person in the room. They do not always know how to ask for help, and many of them became so independent emotionally that they stopped expecting support altogether. So instead, they internalize everything: the stress, the tension, the disappointment, the grief, and over time, their nervous system becomes overwhelmed. That is why many quiet empaths need more solitude than other people understand. Solitude is not rejection for them, it is recovery. It is the only place where they can finally hear their own emotions after absorbing everyone else's all day. Because when somebody is deeply empathetic, their emotional boundaries can become dangerously thin. They begin carrying conversations long after they end, thinking about people constantly, replaying emotional interactions in their mind. Even silence affects them, especially silence. A quiet empath can sense emotional distance before words are ever spoken. They notice energy shifts immediately, and while other people move on quickly, the empath stays emotionally connected to moments long after they happen. That depth can become beautiful, but without boundaries, it becomes destructive. Because eventually the quiet empath starts abandoning themselves in order to maintain emotional harmony for everybody else. They become too understanding, too forgiving, too emotionally accessible. And some people absolutely take advantage of that, not always intentionally, but consistently. The empath becomes the emotional support system, the emotional stabilizer, the person who absorbs chaos without complaining. And after years of this, many quiet empaths begin feeling emotionally invisible, not because nobody cares about them, but because people became comfortable receiving from them without truly checking on them. That is why the phrase "no one noticed" hits so deeply, because many quiet empaths spent years silently carrying emotional pain while appearing completely fine on the surface. Nobody noticed how exhausted they were becoming. Nobody noticed how much overthinking they carried home at night. Nobody noticed how often they felt emotionally drained after being around certain people. And eventually, the empath begins waking up to something important. Sensitivity is not weakness. In fact, many quiet empaths are incredibly emotionally resilient. Most people could not carry that much emotional awareness every day without becoming overwhelmed. The empath did, for years. But resilience without boundaries eventually turns into self-destruction. And this is usually where the awakening begins. Not through confidence, not through empowerment speeches, but through exhaustion, a breaking point, a moment where the empath realizes they cannot continue giving pieces of themselves away to everyone around them. Because eventually, even the kindest person reaches emotional capacity. The awakening of a quiet empath is rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it happens silently. They begin noticing patterns they ignored before. They notice who only contacts them when they need emotional support. They notice how often they feel drained after certain conversations. They notice that some people feel entitled to their patience, but disappear the moment the empath needs understanding in return. And slowly, something begins changing inside them. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop chasing people emotionally. They stop trying to fix every relationship. And for the first time in a long time, they begin protecting their peace instead of sacrificing it. The world often misunderstands quiet people, especially emotionally sensitive quiet people. Some are labeled distant. Some are labeled shy. Some are labeled hard to read. But many quiet empaths are simply overstimulated by a world that never stops emotionally demanding things from them. So they retreat inward, not because they hate people, but because silence feels safer than emotional chaos. And maybe that is what so many quiet empaths are slowly learning now. That healing is not becoming less sensitive. It is becoming more protective of your sensitivity. There is a difference. The goal is not to stop feeling deeply. The goal is learning who deserves access to that depth, because your emotional energy matters, your peace matters, and your silence does not make your emotions any less real. The ones who feel the most often say the least, and maybe that is why their presence feels different, because beneath the silence, there is depth.